Many classes throughout the history of WoW have been incredibly busted for a ton of different reasons. In each episode of this series, I'll take you back to a different point and raid in WoW's history, talk about some classes that were absolutely crazy busted and dominant. Now sit back and buckle up as we journey back to the year 2020 on one of the most dominant melee of the time, Unholy Death Knight.
Remember this lesson.
2020. Truly a year of all time. This year, in all honesty, kind of sucked, but we did get a few fun things like The Last Dance and Tiger King, so you gotta take those victories when you can. Something else also dropped in 2020 though, Shadowlands. Shadowlands was the 8th expansion to the largest MMO, World of Warcraft, and honestly changed a ton of things about the game if you really think about it, as well as decimating the player base, but we're not going to dwell on that.
Stop! He's already dead!
Shadowlands brought with it the first level squish, a revamped new player experience, and a ton of other new systems, like the Covenants, Torghast, Legendaries, and of course, a brand new raid, Castle Nathria. Castle Nathria was a banger, and honestly one of the best raids in recent memory, at least in my opinion. Of course, you do have to ignore Stone Legion Generals, that was terrible, but other than that, it was great. Absolute bangers of fights like Zymox Part 1 and Sludgefist, not to mention the absolute hottest raid boss they've ever made, Nathrius. I mean, just look at this guy. He's so rugged and chiseled and woo. Anyways, this new raid saw a ton of fun fights and fairly solid class balance. Of course, there's a few outliers, one of which we're covering right now, Unholy Death Knight, which happened to just be a perfect storm that we saw 4 of these things in the world first Nathrius kill. Unholy just happened to be in such a good spot during this raid, so let's dive into it. Before we get super nitty-gritty about this spec, let's break down what Unholy Death Knight actually is, maybe for those of you who don't even know. Introduced way back in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, Death Knights are heroes of the Scourge, raised by the Lich King to perform his bidding, before being freed from his mind control and then just kind of deciding to do their own thing and atone for the crimes they committed. Death Knight is split into 3 different specs, the Tank spec, Blood Death Knight, and 2 DPS specs, Frost and Unholy. Unholy as a spec is themed around mastering death and decay, using plagues and undead minions and summons to do their damage. It's basically the Necromancer class from most other RPGs put into WoW. Unholy revolves around a dual resource system, runes that generate over time, and runic power that is generated whenever you spend your runes, and these are both spent on things like Death Coil and Festering Strike to do damage, with their big summons and cooldowns like Gargoyle, Undead, or Army of the Damned doing a ton of their damage. So why was it so busted in the first year of Shadowlands in the first place? Well, let's take a look at what exactly changed going into that expansion. Unholy honestly got a good deal of changes coming out of Battle for Azeroth and into Shadowlands. Some of them weren't really that big of a deal, like an increase to their Violent Plague, which is a dot they have duration, but some of them were massive changes. Things like a baseline of Epidemic, which is their uncapped AoE button, as well as a reduction in the runic cost of Army of the Dead, their strongest cooldown. Further changes to the talent tree, which, by the way, talent trees looked like this back then, not like how you see them now, further lit the path for them to just kind of be insane. New talents such as Unholy Pact, causing them to increase their strength during Dark Transformation and have a cool flaming chain, as well as reworks to Unholy Blight, causing it to increase pet damage, reworks to Army of the Damned to now also cause a Magus of the Dead to be summoned, and these little skeleton mages are incredibly strong. And finally, the rework of Soul Reaper into the strongest execute tool in the game at the time, turning it into a button that cost 1 rune and had a 6-second cooldown where it would explode after 5 seconds for a ton of damage. This wasn't the only change to Unholy though, as their Mastery Dreadblade was changed from just increasing shadow damage to increasing shadow damage and also minion damage. That's insane for a class where most of your damage is centered around a massive CD which summons a ton of hard-hitting minions. Mastery went from being only okay to Unholy to being an absolutely insane stat, amping the damage of all of their strong little guys and making their goons hit incredibly hard to any target they were smacking. These changes alone gave Unholy an incredibly strong damage profile, having the strongest opening burst in the game as well as really good burst on a short cycle because of their cooldowns like Apocalypse and Dark Transformation having very short cooldowns. They also have a lot of downtime resistance because of a lot of their damage coming from pets or ranged abilities like Death Coil, and on top of that, they have Insane Execute from Soul Reaper, really just having a ton of things to work with. That alone would make this class really, really good, not even mentioning how tanky they are with high natural armor as a plate class, as well as stamina, access to Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell, and of course the newly given Death Strike to all specs of Death Knight. However, the two new borrowed power systems from Shadowlands, Legendaries, and Covenants carry Death Knight even further into a crazy spot in the meta. Let's start with Legendaries. Different from systems we've seen in the past, such as the Legion Legendaries with their random drop chance, Shadowlands Legendaries were crafted, with powers being dropped from different sources, and then requiring farming Torghast through roguelike type content in order to obtain currency to craft those powers onto crafted items. The items themselves were honestly pretty expensive gold-wise for a lot of people, but some of these legendaries gave absolutely insane power gains to each spec that used it, and Unholy Death Knight was no exception. The legendary of choice, Deadly's Coil, reduced the runic power cost of Death Coil by 10 and caused Death Coil to also increase the duration of Dark Transformation by 1 second each time it was cast. On the surface level, this seems not that powerful, but in fact was quite strong. Extending Dark Transformation was very good, adding a significant uptime increase to one of their very powerful short cooldowns. The runic power reduction was perhaps even more impactful, as every cast of Death Coil reduced the cooldown of Apocalypse and Dark Transformation by 1 second, and Army of the Dead by 5. The cost reduction to this ability allowed them to net even more casts of these, which thus reduced the cooldown of their cooldowns even more, and the more uses of them, and thus more damage. Covenants, the other borrowed power system from this expansion, also caused a massive direct increase to Unholy. Covenants, in all honesty, were a pretty convoluted system, giving you access to 4 different factions, each with a unique active ability to grant each class per Covenant, and each with 3 sort of weird talent trees you could pick from, giving you talents per tree, but also each spec has things they can put into the tree to unlock other things. I was really convoluted and really restricted from the get-go in terms of swapping, but it did add a lot of power. Unholy in particular gained a large amount from the Necrolord Covenant, granting them Abomination Limb, a 2-minute damaging ability which greatly increased their rune and thus runic power generation, an ability which itself is still found in the current Death Knight talent tree. Unholy also got 2 incredibly strong conduits, which were effectively spec-specific talent choices, one which increased the duration of Dark Transformation further and also increased the damage of minions, and one which further increased the cooldown reduction available to the class. These further combined with the incredibly strong trinket from the other side, Inscrutable Quantum Device, otherwise known as Cube, which granted a gigantic amount of mastery or other stats, or also it could have executed the target or healed or given mana, but during Lust it always gave mastery. It's kind of weird, but it gave a lot of damage. But this trinket further amped their on-pull burst damage to absolutely astronomical levels. Now this incredibly well-rounded, incredibly strong burst damage profile with the best execute in the game, while also being an incredibly tanky class with really strong mob grip utility, might seem to make a very strong class. However, there are 2 things that were also added with the Shadowlands expansion that I haven't actually mentioned yet, which really turned the dial up to 11 and really made Unholy incredibly strong. And those 2 things are Power Infusion and AntiMagic Zone. Power Infusion is actually not a Death Knight ability at all. It's actually a Priest ability, but oh man, is it strong. It was re-added to Priest in Shadowlands after being removed at the start of Battle for Azeroth, the previous expansion, and is a targeted spell that gives the target 25% haste. Haste is a very strong stat in general, that gets very powerful the more you have of it, specifically so for a lot of burst-oriented classes, one of which is of course Unholy. Unholy scales very high with haste during its cooldowns, as all the ghoul's attacks also increase with haste, and ghoul damage of course is incredibly strong for Unholy. Not to mention, more haste also means more casts of Death Coil, which as we know, means a longer extension of their CDs, as well as more cooldown reduction on those CDs, leading to lots and lots of damage. This made Unholy the best on-pull choice for PI, Power Infusion, giving them such astronomical burst damage on pull, it was obscene. You can still see PI doing crazy things today with classes such as Devastation Evoker, Demonology Warlock, and of course, Unholy Death Knight has been rained down a bit, but Power Infusion is still an incredibly broken ability in its own right. These things are all well and good and attribute a lot to what made Unholy so strong, but being one of the best damagers alone wouldn't have attributed to Unholy accounting for 4 slots in a world first kill. No, the final nail in the coffin for this class would be the reintroduction of AntiMagic Zone, further known as AMZ. AMZ is a 2-minute cooldown which placed a bubble down that reduced magic damage taken by 20% for anybody inside of it. And guess what? Almost every single bit of raid-wide damage dealt in raids is going to be magic damage, which means these are very short cooldown 20% raid-wide reductions, thus allowing for each Death Knight, which already brought an incredibly strong and versatile damage profile, an easily scalable raid cooldown, allowing for a ton of damage prevention per Death Knight you brought, meaning there really was absolutely no downside to stacking them, a downside which you commonly see with stacking melee. In fact, they even had to nerf AntiMagic Zone at the end of this patch, adding a cap to the amount of damage it absorbed, nerfing it back down from how it was to what you find today actually. The absolute best burst damage, the best execute, having really good sustained and away from boss damage, being nigh unkillable with high armor, stamina, and strong cooldowns, being one of the best PI targets, and also bringing one of the strongest raid cooldowns in the game at the time, truly made Unholy Death Knight in Castle Nathria one of the historically strongest specs, truly providing everything for a raid comp as well as doing insanely strong damage. They were later nerfed a bit to be brought back down to earth, as well as AMZ being reduced in effectiveness. The rain at the beginning of Castle Nathria leads to them being one of the strongest specs in the history of this game, and will stay with them with the rest of history of World of Warcraft. Hey, I'm Voodoo, and for those of you who don't really know me, I'm a WoW content creator, primarily focusing on Havoc content, but who started to branch out to other specs and topics. I plan on doing one of these videos every once in a while, so if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. But also help me out a ton, and if you couldn't tell, I put a ton of effort into this video. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time as we take a look at Fire Mage during Nyalotha.
Cannot be trusted. And wait.